Have you noticed a disturbing new trend occurring all over university campuses these days?
Candace Owens, Steven Crowder, Ben Shapiro,
Charlie Kirk,
all destroying liberals with truth bombs.
It's like liberals are just getting owned everywhere.
Eviscerated, trigger, destroyed, logic bomb.
I genuinely feel that those people go onto campuses and look for the lowest common denominator, or basically grab anyone they can and then just supercut the whole thing together to make it look like they're just dropping logic like Hiroshima.
Yeah, you're just picking fights with anybody and Project Veritas.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. We should do that. We should go to a campus one day and have a giant sign like "Socialism is onion," like "cuck my mind" or something.
And then just supercut it.
Yeah, supercut all the answers just to see what we get. I just wish there was someone on the other side, someone with dignity, grace, and aplomb, and intelligence who could counter-attack these radicals.
Yeah, isn't there somebody out there who could save us?
Hi, Lance and Dave.
Wow, Professor of Philosophy Ben Burgis!
Subversive, neo-Marxist, university professor. I wanted to tell you what was wrong with the reasoning that Ben Shapiro was using in this clip. Actually, I think what you said was that you wanted me to informal logic or critical reasoning classes where we talk about logical fallacies. We're not really treating these as ways of owning people or destroying people. These are aids towards thinking more clearly and arguing in ways that are more likely to help you arrive at the truth.
Get to the owner!
But that said, Ben Shapiro really does say some very strange and silly things here, and I think an examination of some of the logical fallacies that he's committing might, after all, be in order. So, let's watch the clip.
What is so immoral about believing that a worker is entitled to the full value of their labor, especially given that the enterprises organized in such a way have been shown to be more effective than traditionally capitalistically organized businesses?
Okay, so I think we have to separate out a couple of strands there. Number one, if you're going to talk about the efficacy of workers owning the means of production, are we talking about the government owning the means of production, or are we talking about workers owning the means of production? Because if you're talking about the government, that is wildly untrue, the last statement that you just made that it's effective. When the government owns the means of production, generally everything blows.
If by the government owns the means of production, he's just talking about the Soviet model, then you can make a case for some of what he's saying. Although we shouldn't exaggerate the point. Whereas there were many problems with that system. It was bureaucratic. It was undemocratic. It's clearly not what socialists like me would advocate. It's clearly not like socialists like this GW student who he's talking to here would advocate. But let's also keep in mind that for all the problems with that system, all of its bureaucratism, all of its problems with supplying consumer needs, people in the former Soviet Union, certainly at the bottom of society, were way better off before the fall of the Soviet Union than afterwards. What happened to the former Soviet Union? That's a post-apocalypse dystopia for people who lived through it.
That's actually the story of Cuba. That is the story of Venezuela.
No, it's not the story of Venezuela. Venezuela has a smaller public sector than France. That was true in 2012 at the height of Hugo Chavez's welfare state. It's even more true now that there's been years of austerity since then. What the story of Venezuela shows is that even implementing very mild social democratic reforms in a neo-colonial country like Venezuela means that the United States is going to back repeated coup attempts against you, economic warfare, et cetera, et cetera. None of this is to let the Maduro government off the hook for the many very real bad things they've done. But attributing this story to socialism is just showing that you're not tall enough to ride the intellectual ride. He also just said before that, it's the story of Cuba. No, it's not. Cuba had, again, it's an authoritarian system. It has all kinds of problems. It is absolutely nothing like the model of socialism or what I would consider to be socialism. But even if the kind of socialism that I advocate is very different from the authoritarian system in Cuba, as Ben Shapiro is so fond of saying, facts don't care about your feelings. No matter what your feelings might be about the Cuban regime, the facts are that Cuba had massive strides in infant mortality, literacy, doctor-patient ratio, life expectancy after they nationalized their means of production, primarily the sugar and tobacco industries. Those are the main means of production they have in Cuba following the 1959 revolution. That is a fact.
The democratic socialist countries of Norway are generally not owned, Norway is an exception in which the government owns a lot of stock in various companies, but those companies are run along free enterprise lines. They're not run along redistributionist lines, actually.
I have no idea what Ben Shapiro means when he says that Norway's way of managing its state-run oil company isn't redistributionist. You might think from hearing him talk just now that there was one point where it was totally private and nothing much has changed, but the government has just slowly bought up a bunch of stock in this private oil company until they have the majority share. Not what happened, right? Norway nationalized its oil company and then has since, not because the Norway was like the Soviet Union at its worst, not because state ownership of oil was any kind of disaster. In fact, before these changes were made, they were doing quite well. But as part of neoliberalization relative to where they were at, there was this market reform where this fully public oil company was transformed into a corporation where the government maintained the majority ownership, but private investors could buy stock in it.
If you're talking about workers owning a business together, I am a worker at my company. I own my business with another person who owns the company with me, and a couple of investors. The investors have sunk their labor, which they made money from, right? Money is just a tangible trade for labor.
That last claim was amazing. That any money that investors have to sink into a project must be a matter of some labor that they did. Is Ben Shapiro an alien? Does he have any idea of what the economic system that he lives in is like? Because how this actually works, if you want the details, read Capital Volume 1, where Karl Marx is describing MCM, right? Money, commodities, money, the way that this process works. Profits from past business ownership are far more likely to be what's invested in new businesses than wages paid to workers from who worked at those past businesses. Now, I will say one thing about logic at this point, that he's equivocating about workers owning businesses, that he says, oh, I'm a worker at my business and I co-own it along with this other person and some investors. He knows perfectly well that there's a difference there. So the fallacy of equivocation is when you use the same term to mean two different things in two different parts of an argument.
The fallacy of equivocation.
So in this case, workers owning something, meaning a workers' cooperative, where every employee who has a certain status, maybe after they've been around for a while, every employee has a voice and a vote at the very least in electing whatever board might govern the place. that is a totally different sense of workers owning businesses than what he's talking about, where he says, oh, I own this media company and I contribute some content to it. That's such an obvious slippage between two different meanings of a phrase that even for Ben Shapiro, even for somebody who's as big a hack as he is, it's almost a little disappointing.
Dropping logic. Truth bombs. Well, that's not necessary.
So I'm like, is Bill Gates not a worker at his own company? He invented the company. So I'm also wondering how the worker is not owning his own labor when he freely chooses to alienate that labor in exchange for pay.
This is something that Ben Shapiro does a lot. If you watch as many of his videos as, unfortunately for me, I have. He's setting up a false dichotomy that either you believe in his conception of freedom or you're just using words, you don't have any kind of conception of freedom at all. So either you go with the Ben Shapiro theory of what it is to be a free actor, or you just must not be talking about anything at all when you use the word freedom. One way of understanding what he's doing there is that he's up to his old tricks. He's setting up a false dilemma. Another way of understanding what is going on there, if you take it as some sort of argument for his view about freedom, is that he's begging the question. Begging the question is a phrase that's often misused and misunderstood. Doesn't mean raising the question, it means arguing in a circular way.
Begging the question.
So this is a term that comes from medieval debates that were structured in this very formal way, and the question was the issue that people were talking about, and one side would beg the other to say, oh, I'd like you to grant me this premise, basically, but it was considered illegitimate to beg the question. And the reason why begging the question is a bad thing to do is that you're never objectively giving anybody any new reason to agree with you. So, for example, you're begging the question when you say, as a right-winger, abortion is wrong because it's murder, or for that matter, when you say, as a left-winger, the death penalty is wrong because it's murder, because part of what murder means is wrong killing. So you're saying it's wrong because it's wrong killing. You've smuggled the conclusion into the premises. And if you think Ben Shapiro is giving an actual argument here that, oh, you should agree that workers are totally free under capitalism, he's begging the question here because he's smuggling his particular conception of freedom into the premises, even though that's the central issue at stake between him and socialists like the GW student who he's arguing with here. So one way of understanding freedom is the way that libertarians understand it, and more or less that Shapiro understands it. Shapiro is a lot less consistent than libertarians are. That's the nicest thing I'm ever going to say about libertarianism.
Free ponies for all Americans, one of the overlooked issues in America today. My Free Pony platform is, of course, a jobs creation program. It will create lots and lots of jobs once we switch over to a pony-based economy.
My problem with socialism is that it is essentially somebody subjectively deciding the value of your own labor. The beautiful thing about the free market is that you don't get to subjectively decide what your labor is worth, right? You can't go major in something useless and then come to me and say, I want $100,000 a year for my useless major so I can dig holes in the ground, right? We all recognize that's stupid. But
one, that the price of labor has been quite effectively raised in many contexts to the tremendous benefit of lots and lots of people by such redistributive mechanisms as labor unions and minimum wage laws, and he's leaving that out here because he would screw up his argument. But also, he doesn't want to just say, oh yeah, most people should be in this subordinate economic position, and they shouldn't be paid very much, and they shouldn't have any control over their workplaces, just because they got unlucky, right? Just because they they didn't have the winning ticket in life's little lottery, and that's just. Because even Ben Shapiro, even somebody like that, there's enough humanity in him that that some part of him senses that would be a horrible thing to say. So, what's the alternative? The alternative is doing what people like him have always done, which is tell some fairy tale to explain why the poor deserve to be poor. Why, if you're walking miles a day, working 8 hours a day at an Amazon warehouse, and your back is destroyed by your labor, why you have it coming. So, one version of this kind of fairy tale, of course, is a Calvinist fairy tale about how, God has pre-selected, the people that he likes and the people that he doesn't like, and we shouldn't question, who God likes and who God doesn't like. Another very popular version of this is the Charles Murray version, which is where you tell some genetic just so story about how Black people, Hispanic people, since they tend to be poorer on average, that must be because of some genetic inferiority. Or, of course, in Charles Murray's case, he thinks this is a small part, right? This is the part of his book, The Bell Curve That Everybody Remembers. But it was one chapter, and it's a little bit tentative. His larger thesis in the book as a whole is that poor people of all races are on average genetically inferior to middle class and rich people of all races. So that's definitely another kind of just so story you could tell about this. Shapiro's fairy tale is the poor people are lazy fairy tale, as if you could explain structural poverty by the fact that too many people majored in art history in college, that if enough people had learned to code, then they would all be better off.
Value of theory, which is, the value labor of theory. It's been a long day. The labor theory of value, my goodness. The labor theory of value, which is that the amount of work you put into something dictates the value of the thing, is a bunch of crap. If I spend all day making mud pies outside, that's an awful lot of work. It's also completely useless.
Shapiro's logical fallacy here is the straw man.
The straw man.
Straw manning an argument is what you do when, instead of arguing against the actual labor theory of value, which, by the way, Adam Smith believed in, Ricardo believed in, all of these classic bourgeois economists believed in before Marx, and then because Marx drew political conclusions from it that mainstream capitalist economists didn't like, then they all had to go rushing off in the other direction. But the fact is that Marx's explication of the labor theory of value in Capital bears almost no resemblance to the cartoon that Shapiro just drew there. That, it doesn't matter whether what the exchange value of that it's totally irrelevant whether or not what you're making has any kind of use value or not. It'll still command this exchange value. That's not at all what Marx says. There are serious critiques that smart people make of the labor theory of value. This is not one of them.
Oh, liberated!
The way that you actually determine the value of work is by trading it for somebody else's work in a fully voluntary fashion. So if you're asking whether I'm okay with, for example, private sector unions, workers get together and they go to the owner and they say, we want more of the profit margin. Sure, as long as you're not kneecapping somebody, right? But if you kneecap somebody, then I don't approve of your means anymore. If you're asking me if a bunch of workers decide to get together and form a joint stock corporation, of course, that's how most corporations are formed. Most LLCs are formed this way. It's a couple of guys who get together, band their labor together. It's like two guys. And then after it grows, they decide to hire other people. So we need to be very specific. When you talk about the ownership of the means of production, are you talking about my version? Because that's called capitalism.
The underlying thing there, of course, is that Shapiro, given his inconsistent embrace of a libertarianish theory of freedom, would say that striking workers who won't get out of the way when cops who are herding scabs into the workplace tell them to are doing something horrible. They're violating the owner's property rights, and to him, property rights are the core of freedom. Which, of course, on that theory of freedom, then the civil rights protesters sitting in at lunch counters and not leaving as they're told were also engaged in egregious violations of freedom. So this, if you really do take that theory even slightly seriously and try to draw out its consequences, those get pretty ugly. But that's one point. The other point is just that he is engaged again in a ridiculous equivocation between saying that, oh, there's some people who are going to go in on owning a company together who are going to do some of the work initially, or maybe even on an ongoing basis, but where the bulk of the work is going to be done by paid employees, not co-owners. That kind of workers' control, that the owners are doing some work with what it's obvious that socialists mean by workers' control, which is what you have in really existing workers' cooperatives, that everybody has a voice, everybody has a vote, not necessarily in a direct democratic way, especially depending on the scale of the enterprise, but certainly at least a vote in electing people to represent their interests in managerial positions.
What socialism
There's not
is,
a single theorist of markets who would disagree with a single proposition that I've laid at the roots of what markets are. Not one. Okay, there's not one. And your redefinition of socialist to mean free markets where workers are participating in a free market is bizarre to me.
I find your lack of faith disturbing.
And is very fond of his false dilemmas. Either you agree with his free market ideology, or you advocate the Soviet model. You're not advocating the Soviet model, so you must be agreeing with my free market ideology. If he wasn't interested in just making the student look foolish, if instead he was interested in actually shedding some light on the sources of their disagreement so they could have a more interesting conversation about those points of disagreement, then he would ask the student, oh, so are you in favor of workers' cooperatives only when people can get together the capital to start one within the rules of capitalism? Or are you in favor of expropriating the means of production and then reorganizing them as decentralized workers' cooperatives? Because if he had asked that, I'm pretty sure that he knows, and even the brighter hooting Ben Shapiro fans in the audience know, that the answer would be that second option. That's what the debate is about. Who has money to invest in it or whatever. Of course, people, upward mobility does exist. There are individuals who change positions, but they change positions within a slanted playing field defined by an existing distribution of wealth that you could ultimately trace back to this. And that's Europe. Compared to here in the New World, the European story of the origin of capitalism is almost cozy and consensual. What happened in the Americas is that the economy was initially built up literally by the labor of slaves on land stolen from genocide victims. And that has systematically informed patterns of wealth distribution ever since then. If you're descended from African slaves, you are much more likely to be at the bottom end of the economic ladder than white people are. That's not a coincidence. And if you don't believe in the ridiculous Charles Murray, kind of just so story about genetics, it's not genetics. That's a result of historical patterns of wealth distribution.
I mean, and it also runs wildly anti, frankly, the basic texts of Marxism, like the Communist Manifesto, which requires massive government cram downs, guild organizations at the behest of government, ownership of the means of production crammed down by a massive system up top.
Not at all what the Communist Manifesto says. What the Communist Manifesto says what Marx and Engels say in a number of places. In fact, historically, one of the major distinctions between Marxism and other flavors of 19th century socialism is that a lot of people like Robert Owen believed that, okay, if you had certain cooperative experiments, you would just kind of appeal to the moral impulses of people in power, and then they would patronize these utopian experiments. They'd be so successful that they would become dominant. Whereas what Marx and Engels believed was that it had to come from the bottom up, that it was only working people organizing in their own interest to eventually take over society from the grassroots that would result in the extension of democracy from politics to economics through collective ownership and workers' control of production. That said, I am happy that Shapiro is, just for a minute, leaving alone the stupid semantic argument and actually having an argument about redistribution. Let's see if he sticks to that topic or if he goes back to the semantic bullshit.
You still haven't told me what you disagree with that I've said. You just say that you don't like that I call free markets free markets.
When you say... All right. When you say the word socialism, you paint this Red Scare bogeyman of something that's going to come and crush our individual freedom.
They called themselves the Soviet Republic.
Right, and North Korea calls itself the Democratic People's Republic. Nomenclature doesn't mean anything if it's not backed up by substantial fact. And what I'm trying to say is that what I'm trying to say is that when you say socialism, but you're referring to very specifically state socialism, wherein the government nationalizes all industry.
Nice. The student is floundering a little bit. He's not entirely sure how to respond to Shapiro's ridiculous method of debating him. But in that case, he scored a really solid hit, which is that if you're going to consistently say, if they call themselves the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, you can't say you mean something different by socialism than the USSR, then you also have to say that the German Democratic Republic and the People's Democratic Republic of Korea are democracies. And let's not even get into the really confusing stuff like nurse sharks and jumbo shrimp.
Free market, but it does violate the prescriptions definitionally of capitalism. Again, given that capitalism was defined as a derogatory term, capitalism was defined by Louis Blanc and others.
So are you saying that companies should not be able to have investors?
Yes. The Estates General meeting with the king gave them permission and voting about the things that they could vote about within the French monarchist system doesn't violate the prescriptions of monarchism or feudalism. That's not the issue between a Jacobin and a royalist in France in 1789. The issue is whether power should be taken away from the king and the aristocrats, and so everybody has equal political rights, and the parliamentary system that you have an embryo with the Estates General becomes a parliament that's really in charge in the way that the king was in charge before. Similarly, what's at issue between Ben Shapiro and the socialist student at GW is not whether it's okay for workers' cooperatives to exist to the extent that they can exist, given the extremely unequal distribution of starter capital, et cetera, within the rules of capitalist markets. What's at issue is whether power should be taken away from the corporate aristocracy so that everybody has equal economic rights, and what are currently organized as hierarchical capitalist corporations can be reorganized as democratic workers' cooperatives.
Milton Friedman had his example of the pencil, right? So let's say you own a pencil factory, I'm a worker in that pencil factory. You can have all the machinery, you can buy all the raw materials you want, but without me, and presumably many others like me, to assemble the pencils, all you would have is a pile of wood, yellow paint, graphite, rubber, and aluminum.
Okay.
That would be worth, and that is worth less than the pencil when you try and sell it. And yet, all of that value added by labor, apart from the wages that you give me, which if we're being honest, there is a major power imbalance in our ability to negotiate that. Well,
If all that putting the pencil together requires is basic use of your prefrontal cortex, then yes, your labor is alienable at lower rates than if you are a doctor.
That is the Ben Shapiro solution to structural poverty. Everybody should go to med school. If you didn't go to med school, then you deserve it. You have it coming. Now, along with the supply and demand problem I pointed out earlier, there is also the minor problem that if everyone was a doctor or a lawyer or some other similarly compensated professional, then we would all starve to death because there would be nobody to grow food or to manufacture food products. We wouldn't have the pencils that doctors need to write things down over the course of the day because nobody would be working in the pencil factory. We wouldn't have even if there was food being grown somewhere, we wouldn't have people to drive the trucks to bring it to grocery stores. We wouldn't have people to stock the shelves at the grocery stores. So there's a structural problem here that Ben Shapiro wants to blame the condition of the working poor under capitalism on low-income working people for not having better skills so they can move up in the hierarchy, even though it's structurally impossible for everybody to move up in the hierarchy at once. We'd all starve to death. So this is not a serious explanation. Scenario number one, where the workers all disappear, what happens? The pencil company grinds to a halt. And maybe they'll try to bring in some scabs or use managers as scabs when this happens and strikes, as with the Verizon strike a couple of years ago. There are often hilarious videos of these managers trying to perform allegedly unskilled labor that they can't really perform. But of course, there aren't that many managers, so ultimately you're going to have to bring in a bunch of scabs. So that's just saying, well, there are other workers, right? This particular group of workers is gone. You've replaced them with another group of workers. But what happens if there just are no workers? Well, if there are no workers, there are no pencils. That's it. This is why sit-down strikes, for example, where instead of leaving and going outside and picketing, the workers stay inside and hold the place down, are so effective because that's a pure denial of labor because you can't bring in alternative labor. So that's scenario number one. That's why strikes are so effective. That's why companies are so afraid of unions being formed, because they know that strikes are so effective. Scenario number two, the bosses all disappear. The people who own the company, maybe Jesus is about to come back and they've been raptured up. Maybe they've read their Ayn Rand and decided that they're going to go Galt to protest redistributive government policies. They're going to go live out in a mountain fortress somewhere. Well, here's what would have actually happened in the real life version of Atlas Shrugged. The workers could have reopened the place as workers' cooperatives, as there is abundant historical precedent for. Abandoned factories being reopened as workers' cooperatives. That's what Parisian workers did in the Paris Commune in 1871. That's what workers in the reclaimed factories movement in Argentina did in the early 2000s. There are lots of examples of this all over the world, and as the Socialist GW student alluded to at the beginning of the clip, when that happens, workers' cooperatives actually tend to be at least as efficient and productive by any metric as traditional capitalist businesses. They last for just as long, etc., etc., etc. So, no owners, the workers can run the place just fine without them. No workers, the owners are fucked.
We'd like to thank Professor of Philosophy Ben Burgis.
The ownage was palpable, and his intelligence knows no bounds. And he will be back for another episode of Ask a Socialist here on the Serfs.
Viacon, El Diablo.
If you're a fan of Ben Burgis, and we know you are, and you want to sharpen your mind grapes, check out his new book, Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left.
Hey everybody, thanks for watching. If you want to go down to the corner there and hit the subscribe button and then the bell button, you'll get new updates. It's actually exactly where Dave is showing you right now. This is scientifically accurate. This is where all the new features on YouTube are located. This is us from the future. But yeah, just liking, sharing, commenting, and subscribing, all that stuff really helps the channel out. And thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
And if you want to start a flame war, do that too.
Yeah, if you got some free time to kill, start a fight on the internet.
Start a fight on the internet.